The upcoming Sony film Madam Web may have some of you wondering, who is Madam Web and why should I care about her when it relates to Spider-Man? Well, those are great questions to ask, and with the release of this movie about a month away, the best way to understand who is Madam Web is to give you the most important Spider-Man comics she's appeared in and how she relates to everyone's favorite wall crawler. But before we begin, it's important to note that there are two Madam Webs. The original, Cassandra Webb, is most well known by the children of the 90s and fans of the animated Spider-Man series, and the other, less well known, Julia Carpenter, on which the new movie is based on, is a more recent interpretation of the character. Julia is not a reimagining, but a continuation, and as we move through our list, you'll be able to see the progression and be better prepared to watch the new film as an informed viewer. But before we begin, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps out the channel. And with that, let's begin. Number 9. The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, Issue 210. The Prophecy of Madam Web is her official first appearance in the Spider-Man and Marvel Universe. This issue opens up with Rupert Dockery and an armed gang of masked thugs in the basement of the Daily Globe newspaper. He instructs his men to make sure they grab the good-looking girl and kill anyone else who gets in their way. Meanwhile, in New York's Chinatown, Peter Parker is walking with his friend Deborah Whitman. Peter is mocking Deborah's recent visits to a psychic named Madam Web, but quickly realizes he's late for a meeting at the Globe. As Peter rushes over to the Globe, he finds that the elevators do not work and that he is barred from entering the offices. This is because Rupert Dockery, the man who's trying to take control of the newspaper, is holding an executive meeting to introduce KJ Clayton, the newspaper's owner and publisher. She is there to ensure that the board of directors understands that she is giving full control of the newspaper to Rupert. Peter, disguised now as Spider-Man, climbs the walls to reach the top floor to see what the trouble is. When he enters the same boardroom as Dockery, the gang of armed intruders from the basement enter and put up a tough fight against Spider-Man, but they're able to kidnap Miss Clayton. As Spider-Man pursues, he notices the one and only clue that is apparently dropped by the kidnappers, the same Madam Web advertisement shown to him by Deborah earlier. He decides to track down this Madam Web and see if there's any connection. As Spider-Man enters Madam Web's apartment, he's confronted by her voice beckoning him inside, and she tells him she was expecting him. Spider-Man is taken aback at the elaborate machinery and web-like throne on which Madam Web sits. She explains to him that it's a life support system, and that everything from her breathing to the electricity charging her thoughts are regulated through these devices. She also explains that she's blind in sight, but that she's a clairvoyant, a psychic, can even see glimpses of the future, even calling herself a witch. Spider-Man, not sure what to believe, asks Madam Web to use her powers to help him. She agrees and gives him a clue to the whereabouts of the gang and their kidnapped victim. Madam Web's lead turns out to be correct, and Spider-Man is able to defeat the gang and save their victim, who turns out to be Deborah Whitman posing as KJ Clayton, which was easy because no one's ever seen the reclusive publisher in years. Meanwhile, Rupert Dockery is in the real KJ Clayton's penthouse, explaining that killing her is part of his plan to take over the newspaper. He attempts to finish the job by trapping Miss Clayton inside while a fire engulfs her home. Spider-Man arrives in time to rescue Miss Clayton and capture Dockery. However, Miss Clayton decides to suspend publishing the Daily Globe, leaving Peter Parker unemployed. Depressed and concerned about his financial future, Peter's phone rings. It is Madam Web calling to tell him not to worry, that his financial future will be okay, just not the way he expects, or maybe wants. At the same time, J. Jonah Jameson is also calling Peter, and not so happy doing so. Number 8. The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, Issue number 678. Madam Web makes another brief appearance in this story. This time, we are visited by Julia Carpenter's Madam Web, who is now a mother and has settled into her role as Madam Web. We see subtle differences here between Cassandra Webb and Julia Carpenter. Julia seems to have less patience with Spider-Man and seems more aloof and disconnected emotionally from Spider-Man. Whereas Cassandra Webb, the original Madam Web, was always concerned with making Peter feel comfortable in his role in the universe. Here we see how that dynamic has changed. Our story begins with Peter Parker heading to another day of work at Horizon Labs, where he's taking up joint work with fellow think tank scientist Grady Scraps to check on Grady's personal project called the Break Room of Tomorrow, which is a dimensional portal through time where the person walks into the next day. Grady tests the portal to a skeptical Peter and retrieves for him an edition of the Daily Bugle from Tuesday, even though it is currently Monday. This newspaper highlights the Simcarian Pride Parade with a picture of New York City Mayor J. Jonah Jameson in silver sabre at an event that has not yet occurred. When Peter tries to break room of tomorrow, he walks into a devastated New York City, a wasteland of rubble and death. Inside, he realizes that the room shows how the future would be for the person who walked in if he disappeared for a whole day. Peter grabs a watch from the wreckage and notices it's stuck at 3:10, so he heads back and warns Grady about the situation. Realizing what has gone wrong, Peter believes that he must complete every heroic act that Spider-Man completed and was documented in a newspaper to make things right. He recruits Grady to assist Spider-Man while he tries to fix this future with the help of the Good Tuesday Bugle, which Grady brought. As Peter goes to change into Spider-Man while thinking to warn the Avengers and the Fantastic Four, Madam Web appears to him and tells him that he must not do this, that he has to do the work himself with no other assistance from any other superhero. She explains that the more people he involves, the more difficult it will be to fix things because every new individual pulls on the thread and unravels the future. She then explains that she is busy with a sick child and must return home to await their fate, either success or death. Spidey goes into a desperate battle against the clock to try to avoid the disaster. With the assistance from Grady, Spidey retraces his steps from the Good Tuesday Bugle, from stopping 12 muggers to delivering a child in the middle of the street to stopping Facade, but still nothing seems to turn back the oncoming disaster. Meanwhile, at the Simcarian Pride Parade, the Flag Smasher and members of Ultimatum are planning a massive assault. With time running out, our issue ends with Spider-Man desperate to find out where this disaster will happen and if he can even possibly prevent it. Number 7. The Sensational Spider-Man Volume 1, Issue number 39. This may be one of the darkest Spider-Man comic book issues in recent memory. Not only do we get an extended appearance from the original Madam Web, Cassandra, but also Eddie Brock is back, as is Venom, in the form of a haunting specter inside of Eddie's mind. Eddie Brock was always one of Peter Parker's most dangerous foes, especially when he merged with Venom, the symbiote. The Eddie Brock we get here may be even more deranged. He's in the waning days of his life, battling cancer, and even though he has removed the physical presence of Venom from his life, the ghost of the alien creature still haunts him, like a demon trying to possess and control him. And this is where our story begins. Manipulating Eddie to leave his hospital room, Venom and Eddie make their way onto the roof. Eddie's dark side tells him to kill Nurse Sims, his nurse, in preparation for later, sort of a practice run. When Nurse Sims enters Eddie's room to give him his medication, he comes up from behind her and stabs her to death with a scalpel. Afterwards, his dark side appears before him and convinces him that she deserved it, and that the reason for this dry run is because Peter Parker's Aunt May is currently in that same hospital. She's in a coma and not expected to survive due to being shot by a bullet meant for Peter. For Venom, what better way to torture Peter than to take away his beloved Aunt May? However, Eddie believes that May Parker is innocent, though his dark side thinks that she deserves to die for the crime of raising Peter, the man he believes ruined Eddie's life. Eddie and Venom continue to argue back and forth as Venom gives multiple options to complete the work. Somewhere else in the hospital, Peter, Madam Web, Mary Jane, and Anna Watson have decided to perform a seance in the hospital lounge, while Felicia Hardy keeps watch for them. The seance is to focus on a personal memory of May. This is the last-ditch attempt by Peter to locate May's conscience and guide her back to the world of the living. During the ritual, Peter goes back to the night she was shot. He finds Aunt May, who tells him that she doesn't want to come back, but Peter won't accept that she's giving up. At the same time, Eddie enters Aunt May's hospital room and puts on his black mask. At that moment, a tentacled monster pulls Aunt May into the house as she says her goodbyes to Peter. He runs after her, but the door shuts behind her and he can't get it open. Failing to convince May to live, the seance ends and Peter rushes to May's hospital room with his spider sense ringing like an alarm bell. As he enters Aunt May's room, he finds her unharmed and Eddie standing beside a shattered window. Eddie admits to him that his dark side Venom wanted him to kill Aunt May, but she was too innocent and good for him to go through with it. Then, he shows him the self-inflicted cuts on his arms that he made to suppress his dark side, and after asking Peter for forgiveness, he jumps out the window. But before he falls to his death, Peter catches him with his web, and then Eddie awakens chained to his hospital bed where he finds he is still haunted by his dark side. However, this time, Eddie makes it clear that it is he who is in charge now, not Venom. Number 6. The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, Issue 216. This issue is important because it demonstrates the growing trust and reliance on each other that Spider-Man and Madam Web are developing. This story, titled Marathon, opens with Spider-Man in rough shape after his last battle. He decides to go visit Deborah Whitman, a friend, to have someone care for his injured leg. After changing into normal clothing, Peter takes the subway to Whitman's apartment, and along the way, he wonders if he can start another romantic relationship so soon after the death of Gwen Stacy and his subsequent breakup with Mary Jane Watson. And as he gets off the subway, Peter notices an election poster for Barney Wicker. And as Deborah answers Peter's knocking, she tells him that it would be a good idea for him to come in. That's when her guest, a man named Biff Rifkin, comes to the door and introduces himself. Hurt to see Deborah with another man, Peter quickly excuses himself and leaves. Outside, Peter is too depressed over his current love life, and he's too much in pain to put off his injuries any longer. He decides to web sling over to Greenwich Hospital to have himself looked after by a doctor. And as he web slings, he overhears random conversations, including a husband arguing with his wife over her participation in a city marathon that is scheduled for that day. After arriving at Greenwich Hospital, Peter Parker has his injuries tended to. The hospital is busy with marathon runners being brought in for their injuries. It's then that Peter overhears a group of men planning to assassinate someone. Hearing an off-the-cuff comment about their victim never running again, Peter assumes that they're going to kill one of the marathon runners. His attempts to learn the identity of the men he overheard fails because he cannot put that much weight on his injured leg. So Peter decides to do something about what he heard and gives Madame Webb a call to see if she can help him out. Madame Webb doesn't know the specifics of the assassination plot, but tells Peter that if she should learn more, she will contact him. And now with no other leads, Peter decides to finally head home to rest. The next morning, Spider-Man waits atop the starting bridge to monitor the marathon for danger. No sooner has he arrived does he spot a car speeding towards the runners. He quickly webs up the tires, stopping the vehicle. Checking the driver, Spider-Man discovers that this is not a would-be assassin, but just a drunk driver. And as he attends to the drunk, he doesn't hear a nearby emergency phone begin to ring. Soon the marathon begins, and Spider-Man follows along in the hopes of stopping the shooter. Along the way, he saves the life of a wheelchair-bound racer who gets knocked over the bridge. He also saves some kids who are at danger when the fire escape they're on collapses, and as he's attending to the kids, he still doesn't hear a nearby payphone begin to ring. And as he nears the end of the race, when one of the marathon runners suffers a heart attack, Spider-Man rushes him to a nearby ambulance. And as Spider-Man reaches the finish line, he happens upon J. Jonah Jameson, along with his Aunt May in the crowd. Finally, someone gets his attention to a ringing payphone and discovers that it's a call from Madame Webb. She has discovered that the assassins are waiting at the finish line and are waiting for Barney Wicker to make a speech, as he is their intended target. Spider-Man tracks them down to the rooftop where they're setting up their sniper rifle and easily avoids their bullets and knocks them out by ripping off the top of a water tower and tossing it on top of them. Having foiled this assassination attempt, the marathon concludes uninterrupted. Number 5. The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, Issue Number 229. Nothing Can Stop the Juggernaut is one of the earlier and most important appearances of Madame Webb, as it demonstrates how not only Spider-Man has come to rely on her abilities in time of need, but just how vulnerable she can be and just how much she relies on his protection. Our story begins with Madame Webb seeing visions that she'll be attacked by a large figure, which just so happens to be the Juggernaut, but she cannot see the attacker's identity in her vision. Scared and unable to leave the confines of her life support chair, she contacts Spider-Man and asks him to defend her against whatever it is that she saw in her dark vision. Meanwhile, Black Tom Cassidy is ready to execute a new strategy to fight the X-Men. He wants Madame Webb to join him and Juggernaut in order to be able to predict the X-Men's movements, giving them the ability to defeat them in future battles. Restless and looking for a real fight instead of waiting on a boat in the harbor, Juggernaut leaves Cassidy's yacht and walks along the bottom of the harbor until he reaches Battery Park. He surfaces there and begins his methodic walk to Madame Webb to kidnap her under Black Tom's orders. As Juggernaut makes his way onto land, Madame Webb once again calls Peter Parker in his apartment and asks him for help. However, since she does not know any details, he heads for work at the Daily Bugle. There he talks with Gloria Grant, and together they meet a returning Betty Brant, and then Madame Webb phones him again and warns Peter about Juggernaut arriving to Battery Park. This time, Spider-Man has an actual lead to follow. So Spider-Man arrives to try and stop the Juggernaut, but he's unsuccessful. Every attack Spider-Man attempts just bounces right off of this new foe. Spider-Man even attempts to contact the Fantastic Four and the Avengers for help, but they're not available. Madame Webb tells him Juggernaut's power is related to the Cytoric Ruby, so Spidey goes to Doctor Strange's mansion. Unfortunately, Wong tells him that the Master is also out, so no help there. Spider-Man is left with only the police to try to stop the Juggernaut, and all of them fail as Juggernaut arrives at Madame Webb's apartment. In a last-ditch effort, Spidey electrifies Madame Webb's door with enough electricity to run a city block, but Juggernaut simply absorbs it and walks right through it. And after beating up on Spider-Man some more, the Juggernaut takes Madame Webb out of her chair, unaware that it is her life support system. This puts Madame Webb near death, and now that she's no longer of use to Black Tom, Juggernaut decides to discard Madame Webb onto the floor like a piece of trash. and quits. Spider-Man desperately performs CPR on Madam Web, keeping her alive until an ambulance arrives. She is transported to the hospital in critical condition, and Spider-Man is left enraged and determined to find Juggernaut and bring him to justice. Number 4. The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, Issue 239. Now strikes the Hobgoblin, briefly cameos Madam Web as she recovers from an almost fatal attack by the Juggernaut. It serves to showcase the continuing relationship and reliance Spider-Man has for her and her abilities, along with fostering a familiar relationship. This issue not only features Madam Web, but also the second appearance of the Hobgoblin, a villain bent on stealing and assimilating as much of the old Green Goblin's technology as possible. In the previous issues, the Hobgoblin was able to steal from multiple Oscorp storage facilities before getting the attention of Spider-Man. Norman Osborn, the original Green Goblin, had a hand in building and procuring for the company, and his son Harry has no idea what these rooms may have contained, explaining that his father was a secretive man, that they may never know what was taken. And as the night turns to day, the Hobgoblin returns to his lair to gloat over his recent thefts and his abundance of newspaper coverage. Once he has finished pilfering what he needs, he will consider doing the one thing the Green Goblin failed to do: destroy Spider-Man. Meanwhile, Spider-Man is occupied at the hospital watching over Gwen Stacy, who was shot in a battle with Dr. Octopus. When he is asked to leave by her family, he obliges, but on his way out of the hospital, he comes upon the room where Madam Web has been recovering since he saved her from the Juggernaut. Madam Web claims that she doesn't remember who he is, nor does she have her abilities anymore. Madam Web then asks Spider-Man to turn on the radio before he leaves. When he does, there's a news report about the attack on the Osborn manufacturing building. The wall crawler makes a hasty departure, telling Madam Web that he hoped she will recover. Webb thinks that might perhaps be the case, giving a sly smile as Spider-Man climbs out the nearby window. As he web slings across the city, Spider-Man fears that these attacks on various Osborn buildings could spell trouble. After returning home, Peter decides to clean up, rest up, and oversleeps into the night. Waking up abruptly, Spider-Man rushes out to an old warehouse previously owned by Norman Osborn. Unfortunately, he arrives too late, as the warehouse has recently been picked clean. With only one more location to check, Spider-Man goes to an old theater that Norman Osborn used to operate out of. As he approaches, his spider sense goes off, and he catches the Hobgoblin in the process of looting the supply site. The two battle each other in the street. Although Spider-Man is much stronger than his foe, the Hobgoblin keeps him at bay with a flurry of pumpkin bombs, razor bats, and ghost-shaped smoke bombs. Spider-Man ultimately gets the upper hand when he snares the Hobgoblin's glider, forcing it to crash. Fearing capture, the Hobgoblin uses his finger blasters to explode an open gas main. While Spider-Man is busy cutting off the gas before it can explode even more, the Hobgoblin manages to escape. His body racked with pain, the Hobgoblin wonders how Norman Osborn could have held his own against Spider-Man and is determined to find out the secret behind it. Meanwhile, Spider-Man takes stock of everything that has been happening and hopes things can't get any worse. Number 3. Spider-Man Volume 1, Issue 96. Although Madam Web is known as being a powerful ally to Spider-Man, in this issue we see exactly how vulnerable and dangerous she can be when turned against him. This story not only demonstrates Madam Web's influence on the Spider-Verse and Peter Parker, but also showcases her own demons and frailties in a way Spider-Man readers had not yet seen. Norman Osborn is back and in charge of the Daily Bugle. J. Jonah Jameson, who is extremely unhappy with Norman's interference with real journalism, is now his employee. However, the real target for Norman is Peter, who he taunts and verbally abuses in an effort to play with his mind and break him mentally. But this is all part of a larger plan called the Gathering of the Five, which is an ancient ritual that will destroy Spider-Man and leave Norman with incredible power beyond a mere mortal. But he needs Spider-Man to retrieve a relic to complete the ceremony. Therefore, he manipulates Madam Web into getting Spider-Man to do his bidding by promising her to return her to her youthful appearance instead of being on death's door. Madam Web does what she is asked and appears to Spider-Man in multiple visions, urging him to help her. Being none the wiser and trusting Madam Web after all these years, Peter does exactly what she wants and brings her the relic. In the meanwhile, J. Jonah Jameson has had enough of Norman's threats against his family and his abuse, and confronts him in his office with a gun. But Jonah is unable to become a murderer, and fearing for Norman and Jonah's lives, Madam Web dispatches Spider-Man to the Daily Bugle. But before he can get there, a dragon appears in the city, and it is inferred that it was conjured by the newfound powers of Norman Osborn. Now Spider-Man must subdue it before getting to the Bugle. Norman easily disarms Jonah and is about to end him until Spider-Man shows up to save Jonah, much to Jonah's disdain, because he still hates Spider-Man. But the plan is already in motion and our story ends, with Madam Web coming to terms with what she has done and how she has betrayed her most loyal ally. Number 2. Spider-Woman Volume 3, Issue 1. For those of you interested in more of the source material for the upcoming Madam Web movie, this inaugural issue of Spider-Woman Volume 3 is critical to understanding the Spider family and the women who populate it. Fashion designer Charlotte Witter, posing as a new Spider-Woman and with mutated spider abilities, is kidnapping former business associates so she can feed on them. She has multiple victims wrapped in webbing and hanging upside down in a dilapidated old brownstone in the Bronx. She is vicious and murderous and must be stopped as she poses a threat to not only the human population, but to the web, the strands of time and space that hold the spiderverse together. Meanwhile, Madam Web, as Cassandra Webb, fully aware of the danger, brings together the three other Spider-Women in order to fight her. Julia Carpenter, who is now wheelchair-bound, Maddie Franklin, a new associate of Peter Parker's, and Jessica Drew, the original Spider-Woman who gave up her abilities that Charlotte took. Unhappy with being forced into service, Maddie and Jessica reluctantly follow Madam Web's guidance and track down Charlotte at her hideout. In the meantime, Spider-Man makes his way to the same location, wanting to put an end to the kidnappings. As well, Phil Rodriguez, an NYPD detective, is also on the case and converging on the upcoming battle. As Maddie and Jessica enter Charlotte's lair, they are surprised by her appearance, and the fight begins. Jessica is quickly knocked out of the fight, and Maddie is left alone to fend for herself until Spider-Man arrives. Unfortunately, Charlotte, like many real female spiders, has the ability to entrance their male counterparts, which she does to Peter, once again leaving Maddie to battle alone. And as the fight spills onto the rooftops, Maddie is able to get the upper hand with the help of Cassandra. Maddie too has the ability to leech powers from another, and does so with Charlotte, leaving the villain incapacitated, and Maddie with more power than she thought she could ever handle. Thus begins the saga of the Spider-Women, with Madam Web at the lead. Number 1. The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, Issue number 637. The conclusion of this story arc is both intense and tragic. In the history of Madam Web, this issue becomes so important because how it weaves together the story of Julia Carpenter and the other Spider-Women, Peter Parker, and Cassandra Webb. For those of you who are looking for the source material for the upcoming movie, Madam Web, this is the comic you begin with, as it is the comic book and storyline where Julia Carpenter becomes the second Madam Web. Peter Parker is contemplating what Sasha Cravenoff has done to his whole spider family. Some have been killed, others, like Madam Web, were kidnapped and tortured. Donning his black Spider-Man suit, he swings off to face his foes and exact revenge. And at the Cravenoff mansion, Kraven the Hunter tells his family that though he is reborn, Spider-Man must be dealt with. Kraven pauses before telling them to prepare for war. He threatens almost all with violence, including Sasha, his supposed love, with dismembering of her hands. And in the basement of that same mansion, Arana spits on Grim Hunter after he starts sniffing her. Madam Web tells her to calm down, for everything will be over soon. And Arana cannot understand her crypticness of her sentence, fearing that she also may die. Webb responds that all things die. Julia Carpenter cuts her off, warning her not to try any of that Yoda wisdom on her. Webb simply says that she is also much more. For tonight, everything will change. Sasha then storms in, accusing Madam Web of deceiving them because Kraven has come back from the dead as a madman. Webb simply toys with her, before saying that she sees nothing. Enraged by Webb's taunts, Sasha slices Madam Web in the neck, leaving her for dead. And just before she could order Grim Hunter to take care of the others, the power goes out, and a dying Madam Web says that they have made the spider very angry. Spider-Man has arrived, and he begins to eliminate each member of the Cravenoff family one by one. And as Spider-Man and Arana battle against the remaining members, a dying Madam Web speaks with Julia Carpenter, removes her blindfold, and transfers all of her clairvoyant abilities to Julia just before dying. The second Madam Web is now born. The fight continues in the most brutal fashion. Spider-Man gets revenge for Kane, his clone, by ripping off part of Sasha's face, creating a scar in the shape of a hand. Finally, Kraven comes forth to face Spider-Man. It is then that Sasha realizes that the Cravenoff family wasn't hunting the spiders, but it was the spiders hunting them. And after a prolonged and punishing fight, Spider-Man has Kraven at his mercy, ready to use his own spear against him and end his life. Again, Kraven whispers, "Thank you." However, Julia, as the new Madam Web, appears to stop him, showing him a dark future that if he kills Kraven, he too will become a ruthless killer, causing him to be kicked out of the Avengers, and then the web will be broken. Ultimately, if he does this, he will become estranged from his friends and family. But if he spares Kraven, he will spare millions more. Kraven urges Spider-Man to end this, stating that unless he kills him, he cannot die. Ultimately, Spider-Man refuses, reminding his foe that he has a second chance at life and that he should become a dentist or something. He then turns to his spider sisters, telling them that they can drop the Kravenoffs off with the Avengers. However, before this can happen, the Kravenoffs disappear in a big flash. Flash forward to Potter's Field, Spider-Man, back in his blue and red costume, Julia, now blind, and the new Madam Web, and Arana, wearing Julia's old costume, are at Kane's grave. Julia promises that the Kravenoffs will be back, but the two of them will see her before then, and as she vanishes from view, Spider-Man and Arana then swing off. At the same time, the Kravenoffs have gathered in the Savage Land. Declaring that Sasha has made a mockery of his life and family, Kraven declares that she and the rest of the family will be hunted. If they prove strong enough to survive, then they would be determined to be worthy of being a Kravenoff. Sasha objects, at which time Kraven snaps her neck. Grim Hunter reacts but is stabbed in the neck as well. This compels Alyosha, Kraven's son, to leave their company. Only Anna, the daughter, stays, wanting to prove her worth to her father and strengthen their family. Our story ends as Anna goes chasing after her brother, presumably to kill him to prove her worth. And that's my list. Hope you found this information valuable and that you now have a better understanding of who Madam Web is and what this movie may be all about. As always, let me know what you think in the comment section below, and let me know if you're looking forward to seeing Sony's next offering in its growing Spider-Verse. I thank you for watching, and from south of the border, I am still your reluctant gringo. Salute and a huevo.